Hello, everyone. Emilio, Timia, Professor Mark Raber, good to see you. Very nice to meet you, Tarun, finally.
You too, Thomas.
Now we just had Thomas, who is our professor here too. So I want to thank everyone for joining us in this afternoon here in Brazil, but in other times around the world. We have the honor to having Professor Tarun Kaitan from Oxford University and Professor Mark Raber from Maryland University. We are about to start our seminar here, so we'll go with our pattern introduction here. These seminars, the UFMG Constitutionalism Democracy Seminar Series, are an initiative of the Graduate Program in Law of the Federal University of Minas Gerais and the Digital Const UFMG Content Governance Research, with the support of the UFMG Study Center on Transitional Justice, the UFMG DNet Research Group, the UFMG Center on Transnational and Comparative Juridical Studies, the Iconist Chapter Brazil, the Graduate Program in Law of the Federal University of the Semi-Arid here in Brazil too, the Graduate Program in Law of the Federal University of Uberlândia, of Brasilia, and the Brazilian Association of Political Philosophy and Constitutional Law. Although the results of the presidential elections in the US indicated a point of constitutional resilience, the worldwide trend on democratic and constitutional erosion is still in place. Against this background, the Constitutionalism and Democracy seminars aim to create an online forum of topical, vivid, and interactive academic debate. This series of events provide the opportunity for distinguished, emerging, and early career scholars to discuss, from the perspective of comparative constitutional analysis, the main concerns and challenges affecting the current constitutional jurisdictions around the world. In this episode, we will have the honor to host as the keynote speaker, Professor Tarun Kaitan. Professor Kaitan is the head of the research at the Bonaventure Institute of Human Rights at the University of Oxford, the professor of public law and legal theory at the Faculty of Law at Oxford, a fellow at the Mansfield College, and honorary professional fellow at the Melbourne Law School. He's the founding general editor of the Indian Law Review and founder and advisor of the Junior Faculty Forum for Indian Law Teachers. He completed his undergraduate studies at the National Law School in Bangalore in 2004 as the best all-around graduate student. He then came to Oxford, went to Oxford actually as a Rhodes Scholar and completed his postgraduate studies, BCL, MPhil, and Dr. Phil at Exeter College. Previously, he has been the Vice Dean of the Oxford Law Faculty and Australian Research Council Future Fellow at the Melbourne Law School and a Global Visiting Professor of Law at NYU Law School. To act as a discussant in this panel, we are pleased to receive Professor Mark Raber. Professor Raber held a faculty position at the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland, College Park, from 1993 to 2007, and taught at the University of Maryland School of Law as an adjunct professor beginning in the fall of 2002. In 2004, he was appointed Professor of Government and Law at the School of Law, a title he held until May the 1st, 2015, at which time he received an appointment as the Jacob France Professor of Constitutionalism. In 2016, he was named Regents Professor, one of the only 7 Regents Professor in the history of the University System of Maryland, and the only Regents Professor at the UMB campus. He served as Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Development from 2010 to 2013. The format of the event is the following. We have a presentation by the keynote speaker in 30 minutes, comments by the discussant in 20 minutes, and in the following, answers to the Q&A by the audience mediated by the organizers. I would like to thank our team again, Ulysses, Ana Luisa, Bruno, Natasha, for helping us in organizing this series. The videos will be available on YouTube, and we are recording the panels. If you disagree with that, please turn off your cameras. Thank you very much for the panelists and the discussant for accepting this invitation. And thank you for the audience for joining us today. Professor Kaitan will discuss one of the key issues for not only developing countries, but also consolidate democracies, if this is still a useful classification. The theme is the relationship between liberal constitutionalism and inequality. His main arguments are in the article Political Insurance for the Relative Poor, How Liberal Constitutionalism Could Resist Plutocracy, published in 2019 by the Global Constitutionalism Journal. Professor Kaitan, please, you have the screen.
Well, thank you very much, Emilio, for the kind invitation and for the hosts to organize this panel. And many thanks also to Professor Raber for what I'm certain will be very insightful comments. And to all of you for turning up to listen to me and challenge some of my ideas. So this paper tries to do many things, and some might say too many things, because it's probably a book I really did not want to write and therefore ended up writing a paper. But the two broad things that it tries to tackle are, first, whether material inequality is a problem. And second, if it is a problem, can liberal constitutionalism do anything about it? By the way, I'm posting a link to the paper in the chat if anybody's interested in actually looking at the paper. So the background to the paper is that in political theory, there has been a long and enduring debate about the value of equality and equality of what, and when it comes to material equality, whether what we really want is equality between persons, or do we really care about sufficiency, which is as long as everybody has a minimum threshold, should that suffice, etc. And so here are my claims. These are the things I'm going to say about these issues. The first thing I'm going to say is that liberalism, at least instrumentally, should care about material inequality, or should at least care about gross forms of material inequality. So I'm not going to get into the debate of whether equality is intrinsically valuable. I'm not denying it, but I'm not going to engage in that debate. I'm going to say that for instrumental reasons, we should care about material inequality. And the second claim is that liberal constitutionalism does have the tools to do something about material inequality. How do I, well, before I get into these two broad claims and explain how I get there, I want to say something about the motivations behind this paper. As many of you are no doubt aware, inequality fell out of favor in debates about justice around the late 1990s, when the concern in justice literature broadly shifted, and in constitutional practice, shifted from old left concerns about material inequality to concerns about identity, politics, and recognition. And they have recently come back into focus, largely alongside worries about democratic deconsolidation and populism. A lot of this recent attention to inequality in constitutional scholarship, like much else in our field, is framed around the American experience. By American, I mean the United States experience, and continues to exhibit an American exceptionalism in its arguments. So even when there are arguments made about the the importance of inequality in constitutionalism, it's not that those arguments tend not to be general arguments. They tend to be arguments rooted in particular constitutional traditions, like invoking ideas of republicanism in the American tradition. I wanted to think more generally about whether constitutional theory has something to say about inequality, devoid of or divorced from particular constitutional traditions. The second is that the second motivation behind this paper was that in a lot of this literature, the concern for inequality manifests itself in a concern for the well-being of Middle America. And I was more interested in exploring the bottom 20%, or if you're concerned about inequality, it seems a little bit strange to me to care about the middle class rather than those at the bottom of the economic hierarchy. And the concern for Middle America is expressed or justified by a worry about the stability of the liberal order, that the rise in populism is making things unstable because the middle class is losing out. And while I'm not dismissing that as a concern, if the empirics are right, that is a legitimate concern, but that is not my concern. So while I'm going to make an instrumental argument, I'm going to make an instrumental argument for why we should care about the worst off in an economic order. Perhaps you could call it a prioritarian project in the sense that Derek Parfit used the idea. So here is the start of the first part of the argument, which is why is material inequality important for liberal constitutionalism? I find it surprising that while liberal political philosophy has a long tradition of engaging with inequality, and I should just say in general that when I speak of inequality, I mean material inequality, unless I say otherwise. And within the liberal tradition, we see a whole range of viewpoints on equality, ranging from libertarianism to sufficiency to prioritarianism to egalitarianism as views within the liberal family. Liberal constitutionalism has largely cabined material inequality as a matter of governmental policy rather than constitutional doctrine. Now, in large part, this is down to the legacy of John Rawls, the intellectual legacy of John Rawls, who, despite including the equality principle within his two principles of justice, still insisted that material equality must not be constitutionalized. So for Rawls, while equality was important for the basic structure of a just and liberal society, for reasons that I think are due to his limited familiarity with constitutional possibilities outside the United States, there is an enduring insistence in Rawls that the difference principle, which is his principle about material inequality, should not be constitutionally entrenched, that it should be left to the government of the day. And Rawls gives two broad reasons for this surprising limitation, where he admits this is part of the basic structure, but not part of the Constitution. And the first reason, actually, I'll come to his reasons in a little while. But I want to present the structure of my arguments to show why this is wrong and why material inequality ought to be a constitutional concern for liberals. Right? So I take it to be a relatively uncontroversial liberal premise, drawing upon Rawls's own work, but you can fit it within most liberal traditions that take the right to fair political opportunity seriously. That the liberal tradition does not accept permanent political lockouts of persons or groups of persons. This is an idea that is, I believe, extremely settled and mainstream, both in liberal theory and in liberal constitutional practice. Although manifested mainly in the context of ethno-cultural groups, the idea that if in a given social context, a democratic system is likely to lead to a racial minority or a religious minority being permanently or quasi-permanently excluded from the political system, liberal practice and liberal theory accept that we need to provide some sort of accommodation measures, whether consociational or centripetal, to make sure that that does not happen, that a permanent political lockout is avoided. And that is justified both for legitimacy reasons, that if any section of the people is permanently locked out of the political process, that makes the system illegitimate on fundamental liberal principles, both of moral equality of persons and of political equality and of the right to fair political participation. It's also justified based on stability arguments, right? That permanently excluding a section of the people from the political process creates an unspent political force, which over time will become increasingly powerful. The pressure will grow and it will find an outlet outside the system if the system itself does not provide a safety valve to let it out. So both for legitimacy and stability reasons, liberal theory accepts and liberal practice enshrines the idea of political insurance for groups that are endangered by permanent political lockout. My argument is that significant material inequality can also lead to permanent political lockouts, this time for an economic group rather than an ethnocultural group. And for the very same reasons that liberal constitutionalism cares about ensuring that racial or religious minorities are not locked out, it should care about the poor, the relative poor, not being locked out. And this argument does not trade, is irrespective of whether the poor have access to the sufficient amount of resources necessary to live a good life. So I'm assuming, I'm taking it for granted that even in society, that the society we're concerned about already provides all the minimum level of goods and services you require to live a relatively decent life, right? Even in those societies, there is a problem with gross material inequality. So what is the basis of this claim? The first premise is I think, a relatively uncontroversial premise, that neoliberal policies increase inequality. I don't think even neoliberals will fight this. Of course, there are justifications. You have an increase in inequality, but you still lift all boats, right? But the descriptive claim, I take it to be relatively uncontroversial. Right? The second move in this claim is that relative inequality manifests itself as relational power. Relative material inequality, notwithstanding access to sufficient resources, creates a power differential between the economic haves and the economic have-nots, say the top 20% and the bottom 20%. Once we acknowledge that power differential, the next move is to invite you to notice certain features, certain general features of power. This is what power is. Power is by nature resilient. In constitutional theory, we often talk about the idea of self-enforcing constitutions, right? Constitutions that have the ability to enforce themselves. But power is the ultimate self-enforcing concept. Power begets power. Power seeks to aggrandize itself. Power seeks to perpetuate itself. So the first feature of power is that power is, by its nature, resilient. It seeks to continue to exist and expand over time and space. The second feature of power that I'm interested in is that power is convertible. That power does not respect domains of human life. Economic power has a tendency to want to convert itself to political and social power. And social power has a tendency to want to convert itself into cultural power and economic power and political power. And likewise, political power has a tendency to convert itself into economic power and so on. Right? So it is the nature of power that it's both resilient and it's convertible. It's very difficult to keep power cabined within a single zone of sphere of human activity. The third feature of power that I'm interested in is its subtlety. Power is subtle. Power can be very subtle. Stephen Luke's distinguished between my power to coerce you to do what I want, which is subject you to my will, which is the most direct form of power. A less direct power is the power to control the agenda. So your concerns never get on the table, only mine do. That's a form of power. But the subtlest form of power is the latent sociocultural and ideological patterns that structure power. And they operate so subtly that the powerful, as well as those upon whom power operates, may not be aware of its operations. This power is not exercised, but it's operated upon and operated by. And if you prefer, this is not very far from the Gramscian idea of hegemony. So, so whether you use Luke's or the Marxist tradition of Gramsci, we will reach the same endpoint. So what are the implications of these ideas? Oh, by the way, obviously when liberal constitutions give political insurance to a racial minority, for example, it's based on the presumption that power is convertible, right? Because you are worried about the conversion of social power into political power, which is the entire point of giving the political insurance. So convertibility ensures that one person, one vote, formal political equality is not adequate to satisfying the Rawlsian liberal ideal of fair and equal political opportunity. Why? Because influences outside of that formal equality, material, social, cultural, and political power, will ensure that the vote distribution is extremely unequal, and it'll manifest itself and again, this is not surprising. This is, we all know that formal equality does not necessarily translate into substantive equality. The subtlety of power makes this an extremely difficult process to identify and to challenge and to organize against. The convertibility of power ensures that economic power of the very rich over the very poor translates into political power of the very rich over the very poor, which can lead to the political lockout of poor. And the hypothesis here, the assumption, is that the convertibility of power is in proportion to the extent of power. So once material inequality crosses a certain threshold, power becomes, economic power acquires a certain weight. Its political manifestation will not simply work to the disadvantage of the poor, but will likely lead to their political lockout. And when that happens, the subtlety and resilience of this power will ensure that this lockout is semi-permanent. Another word to describe the system would be a plutocracy, a system which will go through the motions of democratic governance, but in fact will be a plutocratic system. Why is this a constitutional theory problem? It is a constitutional theory problem to the same extent that political lockout of any group is a constitutional problem. It challenges both the legitimacy and the potential stability of the liberal constitutional order, and therefore requires not just policy solutions, but constitutional solutions. So here are the Rawlsian objections, or at least the main reason why Rawls did not want constitutions to enshrine material inequality was a worry about, an institutional worry about transparency of constitutional norms. And the worry was, and there's a lot of sort of post-Rawlsian literature on this, which is cited in the paper that you can see. But the worry was that an anti-plutocratic norm might be too opaque for the citizen to know when it is breached, or invite judicial clarification, which raises the counter-majoritarian difficulty. And no prizes for guessing that this worry mimics or sort of betrays several assumptions about what constitutions do, and assumptions about how constitutions are enforced, especially through judicialization. So the imagination of constitutionalization is constrained, limited by the American experience. So basically, Rawls's main worry was, if you put material inequality in the Constitution, that means we'll give judges too much power. As I will show shortly, that's a misplaced worry. It's a worry that A, applies to many constitutional norms, and B, judicial enforcement is not the only mode of constitutionalization. The second worry is a worry about unintended consequences. And this is largely the neoliberal objection, right? That politics has limited potency, that markets are more powerful, and that well-intended political interventions can have dramatically unintended consequences in a sphere like the economy. The strong version of this argument is clearly untrue. There is a lot of data to show that the policy orientation of governments matters to inequality, that left-wing governments do tend to reduce inequality, right-wing governments do tend to increase inequality. So the strong claim that state can do nothing about inequality is clearly untrue. The weak version, I think, should be taken as a design constraint, just as the vagueness of the norm is an important design constraint in thinking about what we should do about this. I think the weak version of the norm, that political interventions, when crafted with a measure of rigidity that cannot anticipate the nature of future challenges, can indeed have design challenges, can have unintended consequences. Right? But the two worries pull in opposite direction, because the Rawlsian worry about institutionalization of an indeterminate norm demands certainty and clarification, whereas the second worry about unintended consequences demands flexibility of the norm that you're constitutionalizing. And therefore, the design challenge is, if we are to constitutionalize it, is there a Goldilocks zone between certainty and flexibility that these norms can occupy? Can I check how much time I have left? By my watch, it's about 8 minutes or so. Is that right, Emilio?
Yeah, that's right. But you can go beyond that. Don't worry.
Okay, sure. No, I don't want to just speak for the entire time we have. And so so now I'll move to the final section of the paper, which is to think about what, if anything, we can do about it, right? Or liberal constitutions can do about it. Now, this is largely speculative. I don't have, I'm currently visiting Chicago Law School for the term, so it's so I worry about making any empirical claim, because I can imagine colleagues here telling me immediately, where is your data? Show us your data, right? So I don't have empirical data to show causal effects. What I've done here methodologically is this, right? I have used what might be referred to as the anti-Franken state, right? So Kim Lane Shepley, in explaining what Orban did with democratic deconsolidation in Hungary, said that he borrowed bad bits of good democracies to create this Frankensteinian monster of a democratic state, where you take gerrymandering from here and elected judges from there, and no system is perfect, and you put everybody's bad bits together, you have a terrible system. So what I've tried to do is to put the good bits of liberal practice together, right? By liberal, I mean self-identifiedly, or at least aspirationally liberal states, including a lot of post-colonial states, and liberal constitutionalist states, even if their policies may be liberal from time to time, policies of the government, right? So the last part of the paper provides a broad map of design possibilities. And this is not a manifesto. I know that context matters, and every system has to figure out what it can do and what might be effective. We can classify these possibilities into two categories. One is the egalitarian camp. The second is the anti-plutocratic camp. Egalitarian norms, institutions, and mechanisms seek to actually reduce the gap between the very rich and the very poor economically. So they seek to reduce economic power directly. Anti-plutocratic norms seek to stop the conversion of economic power to political power. And I'm not presenting these as alternatives. I think a sound system will need a combination of both types of norms, both keeping economic inequality in check and also ensuring that economic power does not translate into political power. So for the first set of solutions, egalitarian solutions, solution possibilities, again, this is all multi-pronged, right? One strand of the possibilities here are normative, which is, the original sin of equality jurisprudence goes back to the slaughterhouse cases in the United States, where the vast possibilities that the text of the 14th Amendment opened up were quickly cabined and confined to discrimination, and discrimination based on race, or later by extension to discrimination that looks very much like racial discrimination. Right? So very soon after the right to equality is born, material inequality is decidedly carved out of it, and obviously goes on to influence much of the liberal world thereafter. But a stronger reinsertion, explicit reinsertion of material equality as a preambular value, which performing both identitarian and expressive function regarding the egalitarian character of the state itself, what Jeff King calls mission statements, I think would be probably the first step in this direction. That should lead to certain key and perhaps long overdue interpretive moves in relation to the right to property, which in some ways is the biggest impediment to an ambitious redistributive program. Right? And again, this is speculative, but there are many possibilities here in thinking about what right to property entails, from thinking about who has this right to property, only natural individuals, or also corporations and also large corporations, right? It's not self-evident to me that the right to property to individuals is extended to all persons. What is property? Whether it includes fundamentals like housing and clothes and things to earn a livelihood, or stocks and shares and huge tracts of land and super yachts. It includes the possibility. So it's clear that obviously large corporations are the main driver of neoliberal economic power. So I think an interpretive move limiting the right to property can be quite important and interesting, but also counterintuitively, perhaps an expansion of the right to property can be a hugely important move in thinking about material inequality. And here, obviously, what I have in mind is the positive duties literature in human rights field. Right? If property is so important, and I believe it is, to well-being, to your security, to your sense of how you imagine your future to be, to have an insurance in life, right? An argument for a universal right to property, a minimum stake, property stake that is available to all. If we read 19th century debates about the extension of franchise in the Reform Act of 1832, right? The main argument of the conservatives who do not want the franchise to be extended to non-property owners is that property gives you a stake in the longer term interest of the state. That property is non-transient, as you are, right? So if you have property, you become more grounded, more rooted. I think there is something there to that argument. What they got wrong was they thought the solution to that was to keep the vote only to the propertied, whereas the right response would have been to give property to everyone and the vote, right? So anyway, there are many possibilities with property, but that requires the constitutionalization of material inequality. Material equality is a constitutional principle, because only then you have two principles of equal weight that need to be balanced out against each other. Whereas currently, when material equality is thrown out of the constitutional field to the policy field, it is a subservient norm that serves the constitutional principle of property and can never fight it on equal terms. I think a limited right to material equality of the sort that Section 1 of the UK Equality Act can be hugely significant. Again, no surprises for knowing that the UK Section 1 of the UK Equality Act has not been brought into force yet in England. Section 1 of the Equality Act requires the government, in making any decision of strategic importance, to give due regard to the need to reduce material inequality. Yes, judges are terrified of having to make decisions with deep distributive implications, but a procedural duty of, when you were making this decision, did you do your homework? Did you check what implications it will have on equality? That's easy for judges. And in fact, a similar duty in other contexts imposed under the Equality Act is where the primary action in British discrimination law today is, where judges find it very easy to procedurally strike down a decision and say, go back to the drawing board and think about equality when you take it again, right? So even with the judiciary, the choices may not be either or. A huge normative source of egalitarian ideas is in something called constitutional directives, which are political norms found in many post-colonial constitutions. I have a paper on that. I've just sent a link to it, which structure the political state and impose normative duties on the political state to think about various goals. And a lot of these post-colonial states include material equality as a key directive. Some of the newer states have started experimenting with political enforcement of these directives. So Nepal, for example, the new Nepali constitution has a standing committee in Parliament dedicated to the political enforcement of directives, right? Where the government is made accountable to the Standing Committee on what it has done on directives. The Thai constitution requires every new government to present an agenda within 100 days of coming into office for what it's planning to do about constitutional directives. So there are things that liberal constitutions can think about to enforce substantive political duties beyond the courts. And obviously the nature of enforcement will look very different. I know I'm running out of time, so I'll just finish up quickly with highlighting a few anti-plutocratic solutions. These are in some ways the hardest for any system to imagine and to enforce. Why? Because given power's resilience, it presents a moving target. Every time the system will come up with a bunch of rules to stop the conversion of economic power into political power, economic power will seek to game it. So you have to be extremely flexible and constantly innovating here. I think alongside material equality, fair political opportunity has to become a stronger preambular value, and the right to political participation has to be interpreted to go beyond the mere right to vote, to stand in elections and free and fair elections. It's surprising that that right is still in most jurisdictions still interpreted relatively formally. And the least radical interpretive move that can be made with the right to political participation is to outlaw semi-permanent political lockouts. The judges already have tools to do this in the context of indirect discrimination law or disparate impact law. Right? Judges have learned to think about disproportionate impact of certain moves on certain groups of people. It's not terribly hard for a court to examine the evidence on what the requirement of identity cards, how that will play out on certain communities, but not just racial communities, also on the poor, for example, in certain contexts. So there are limited judicial possibilities there. The one political possibility is probably the hardest to implement, which Roberto Gargarella calls the engine room solution, right? Which is political power sharing. With race, with gender, with any other ethnocultural identity, you can make sure that the community will send its own representatives who will represent the community in the institutions of government. With the poor, the difficulty is that in any reasonable state, public officials are paid well, and therefore the link to poverty on becoming an official is broken, and it's broken pretty quickly. So you have to rely on a sympathy with your past self. Even if you lower the political costs of getting into the levers of power sufficiently, people stop being poor when they become politically powerful, because it's not just economic power that translates into political power, but also political power translates into economic power of some sorts. The final possibility that can be imagined here, by the way, there are things that the paper talks about, from economic and social council, the Dutch-style councils, to trade union and NGO representations. The final thing I want to put on the table is something akin to a guarantor institution for material equality. Again, I have a paper on guarantor institutions. I've just posted a link to it. The idea of guarantor institutions are that these are institutions created to protect and guarantee constitutional norms that regular constitutional actors have very good reasons to renege on. Right? Free and fair elections is a clear example of a principle that constitutionally powerful actors have very clear reasons to breach, because it's in their interest to not have free and fair elections, right? Which is why we have guarantors in the form of electoral commissions. And for exactly the same reason, because of the worry about plutocracy, etc., I think there are good reasons to have a guarantor institution for material inequality, or empower existing equality commissions to do more about it, if only in terms of political enforcement. For example, wouldn't it be nice if every annual budget was was assessed not just on its likely impact on the GDP, but also on the 2020 ratio, right? Which is how will it impact inequality and in raising the political salience of the inequality ratio. So I'll end there by just noting that I know that everything here is within a constitutional context, and when it comes to material inequality, the global dimension is very hard to ignore. That a lot of these things are beyond the control of individual states, but obviously the global order itself is a consequence of at least the internal order of key states, and therefore the more take-up of these ideas that happens domestically within the constitutional sphere, hopefully we will see a change in the international order as well. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Kaitan. It was a really rich lecture. I think that you explored the most important parts of your paper, and I think that we'll have some really good comments from Professor Mark Raber in the following, and then we'll have the time for the Q&A. Thank you again.
Well, thank you very, very much. I would like to begin by saying it's a pleasure to be here, but of course I'm in my basement, which is a total mess. So I'll have to begin by simply saying it's an honor and a pleasure to participate in this event. That, by the way, the lectures, you've had an amazing group of people, and Professor Kaitan is one of those amazing people. He has presented, as always, you know him, a terrific paper. If you just look at the footnotes, the learning is remarkable. But it's not simply sort of blind learning, look, Mom, I can cite, all these literatures. That Professor Kaitan has a passion for the health of democratic systems and a passion for measuring that health by the status of the least fortunate among us. The main problem I have in presenting these remarks is that I largely agree with him, and he says it better. There were just numerous places where I thought, aha, there's a point I could make. And 2 pages later, there's the point, said better than I was going to do so, that he is absolutely right, that it's a problem of constitutional theory when people are locked out of both power and office. And in fact, in constitutional democracies, an increasing number of people are locked out. So the advice I can give, particularly to the young people, when you get stuck in a circumstance with a wonderful paper you largely agree with, there are 2 strategies. The first is find something trivial and harp on that. I'll start with that. Then talk about what you do, and at some point, add the relevance to the paper, however strained. I'll also go with that strategy. So to start with the trivial, at some point, Professor Kaitan notes that the choice between laissez-faire and interventionist strategies is in fact a choice. That it's just as much a choice as to say, don't regulate as do regulate. But I want to rephrase that in a way that I think makes his argument stronger. That is, there's no such thing as laissez-faire. Anarchy might be laissez-faire. But as far as I know, conservatives believe in court buildings. You have to build them, they get built with government money. They pay government money. Your tax money goes to judges. There's a whole law of contract and property made by legislatures. So all we have are different schemes. In one sense, there's no such thing as redistribution versus non-redistribution because contract law redistributes money as much as, say, tax law or progressive taxation. And so, in fact, I think the baseline is even more favorable. It simply says you can't use government to create economic policies that lock you in. But mostly what I want to do is take a look at some of this from the perspective of political development. I think Professor Khaitan's paper is written from the perspective as law/political theory. I want to do what I do, is sort of law/political development. And we start at a place Professor Khaitan talks about the poor as a threat to liberal democracy. They're a threat because there are always more poor people than rich people. And if you have one person, one vote, a democracy, the first thing the poor people are going to do is redistribute the hard-earned property of the rich. The poor, as Professor Kaitan pointed out, lack grounding in the community. They also lack knowledge. And if we read the political science of the 1950s and 1960s, they are instinctively authoritarian. One of the really good advantages of an education from the best universities in Brazil, the University of Chicago, London School of Economics, is you become a democrat. Unlike people without that education who are foils for the Hitlers, the Orbans, the Putins of the world. So the classical solution was twofold. First, you had property qualifications for voting, for office holding. But as, if not more important, as property qualifications weakened, you structured government to limit the influence of the poor. The first thing you did was you had larger election districts and longer terms of office that would weaken the tether between the elected and those who did the elections. So the idea was, as Professor Kaitan correctly pointed out, people in office become elites. If you're a representative, you are by definition not a man of the people, because a man of the people doesn't get to hold high office. You weaken the links so that the ordinary person has less power and the knowledgeable representative has more. Second thing you do is you move important decisions into non-electoral institutions, bureaucracies, and most important, the 19th century courts. And here's where I join the argument and want to raise some questions. For Professor Kaitan, it's extraordinarily important that we have judicially enforceable rights. But for most of world history, courts, because of their construction, have been on the side of property holders. So, for example, courts have always been anti-union, with very rare exceptions. And in fact, if you look at the union strategy in the 19th century, poor people's strategy, African-American strategy, win in the legislature and just say this doesn't belong in courts. And this is even true among contemporary liberals. If we look at the Warren Court, it was really good about a lot of rights, but nobody celebrates the Warren Court in the United States as particularly union-friendly. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was not particularly union-friendly. Courts, at their best, behave like upper-middle-class liberals, and upper-middle-class liberals are typically not in unions. So that's one thing. It is interesting that the solution to the problem of plutocracy is a method in the 19th century was thought to be a solution to the problem of democracy. So what happened to these democracies? There was a revolution in the 19th century of less well-off white males in the United States and elsewhere. By the early 20th century, universal male suffrage had become the norm in theory and in practice. That is to say, it was the case in an increasing number of countries. All white males could vote, and it was often the case that all white males did vote. And what brought that about? A set of institutions, not quite governmental, political parties. Political parties in the 19th century were thought to be a vehicle by which less well-off citizens, by uniting, could defeat the plutocrats of the world. Unions were thought to be a vehicle that, again, less well-off people, by uniting, by acting in harmony, could defeat the plutocrats. Various interest groups mass base. And the reason they thought they could possibly defeat the plutocrats is politics. Till about 1970, depended a lot on bodies. And less fortunate people have the same bodies as more fortunate people. It's not to say, okay, I'm significantly uncoordinated and I need naps regularly. That's been true since I was 12 years old. But if we were to survey people on their capacity to leaflet, to knock on doors, to do all the things you did politically in 1920, we discover there's not much difference in poor people capacity, rich people capacity, not much difference in race, not much different in gender, not much difference in sexual orientation. So a politics of bodies was an equalizing politics. And another advantage of the politics of bodies was people got information suited to their body. In a union, you got the view of the world that supported your union, not a view of the world that made you think your manager was really, really good person. Now, we need to understand something about a politics of bodies, and this I'll talk about a little more. A politics of bodies served the less well-off, not the worst off. To be in a union meant you were probably lower middle class, not lower class. The lower middle class has the time, has the resources to engage in politics. The worse off doesn't. But it is still the case in many countries that a politics of bodies, which gave some power to the less well-off, produced policies, whether you like them or not, tariff, cheap land, the opening of slavery to the opening of the West to ordinary farmers that benefited more average and less well-off citizens. And in this respect, I think Professor Kaitan, if he had to do it again, wouldn't say simply the worse off 20%. Countries are different. In India, in a caste system, it may be, there's a real difference. You're in the bottom 20%. There's a real difference between you and someone who's in the 20th to 40th percentile. In other regimes, it's a slippery slope. And what the slippery slope may mean is that, in fact, if you're in the 35th percentile, yeah, you've got enough in common with the 15th percentile that you can at least protect them. Now notice what I'm talking about. It's, I think, one of the virtues of the paper. And that is what Professor Kaitan at the end says is we need institutions that protect the less well-off. Not simply good laws, because I promise you, write a good law and have plutocrats interpreted, implemented, it's not going to happen. Whereas if you get the union leader in government, even if the union leader is famous book by Michels pointed out, even the union leader has some differences with the union, you will get better policies for workers, no matter what the law says. So what I want to suggest we're dealing with is not simply a dramatic increase in the difference between the rich and the poor, but as part of that dramatic increase, a decline in the politics of bodies. Political power now requires money far more than a body. You don't need bodies to distribute your message by television. You do not need bodies to distribute by the internet. My door, living in a similar suburban community that I lived in growing up in, gets knocked on far less for people engaged in politics. And because of that, the affluent have the tools to not only engage in politics more, but to engage in information. The result is a different and far more plutocratic elite than even the framers of most constitutions wanted. It's rather interesting. In the American case, most framers lost money in politics. Maybe their friends made money, but it's remarkable how many major framers, including Thomas Jefferson, who spent his last days desperately selling off parts of Monticello, including, by the way, a lot of slaves, to stay solvent. Nowadays, politics is the place we make money. So the challenge is how to bring back a politics of bodies. And my suspicion is that campaign finance reform is not a great place. First, because money finds a way. Second, campaign finance reform tends to help incumbents. And by the way, campaign finance reform isn't going to help the bottom 20%. It might help the bottom 40% who can actually give $5 to $10 to a series of candidates. But it may be we need more workplace democracy. We need to strengthen unions. We may have to accept more religious participation in politics because churches, temples, mosques are where ordinary people congregate. We'll have to accept some problems. There's a wonderful book called Affirmative Representation that shows, in some ways unsurprisingly, that organizations for the worst off tend to advocate for the best off of the worst off. So in the United States, affirmative action in law school is a big deal. In other words, if you are an African American and you get to the point where you're a viable candidate to be a professor at a law school, the civil rights organization chips in for you. But if the problem is, right, that too few poor people, too few women, too few African Americans get to the point where we can say, yeah, you're a viable candidate. But I think in some ways we're going to have to accept that Professor Kaitan, who is a much nicer person, a far more decent person than I am, proposes bottoms-up solutions. We start by empowering the worst off. And by doing so, we may have a more egalitarian society. I confess to a bit more trickle down, that it may be in the United States, for all the reasons, and constitutional democracies across the world, for all the reasons you suggest, we ought not simply try to strengthen the middle class, get more people in the middle class. But it may be, given the tools we have, strategies designed to take people in the lower middle class to the middle class, will have the effect of moving more people in the lower classes to the lower middle class, and maybe the best we can do, at least as this story of political development suggests. But again, thank you very much for allowing me 20 minutes to tag on to a spectacularly good paper.
Thank you so much, Professor Mark Raber. Really valuable comments. I think that we should leave a moment for Professor Kaitan to give his replies, and then in the following, we can open the floor for everyone. Professor Khaitan.
Thanks very much, Amelia. So I mostly agree with the comments. So thank you very much, Professor Raber, for these very thoughtful ideas. I'm just going to respond to a couple of things. On courts and the poor, I completely agree that the socioeconomic profile of most judges always has been and is likely to continue to be, ranging from the middle class to the upper middle classes. And given that profile, we should not expect a radical sympathy for the poor anytime soon. Courts are very good at doing some things when well designed. And so the paper is actually as much interested in defanging the courts and their ability to get in the way of redistribution as it is to empowering them to do something about it. In fact, I think there are sort of three broad proposals that I talk about in relation to courts, and two of them are about defanging them. So first is the move on right to property. And by extension also freedom of contract and freedom of association, all these classical liberal freedoms and rights that courts have used to stand in the way, obviously the Lochner era quite dramatically, but quite frequently to stand in the way of, even when legislatures did try to do something about redistribution, courts got in the way. Right? And that is where I think elevating material equality to a constitutional norm will at least give the other side something to fight with. You may not win all the time, but you'll have a better chance than you have now when all you have is freedom of contract and right to property as constitutional norms and material equality as the preference, ideological policy preference of a government, right? And that's just a David and Goliath match where the policy preference is never going to win over. So that's to equalize the fight and maybe reduce the ability of courts to stand in the way. The second idea, and this I develop in the related paper on directives that I sent the link to, and Emilio kindly posted the paper here in the chat. So what constitutional directives do is that they carve out an area of state action for politics and immunize it from law. So when the Constitution directs the state to endeavor to reduce material inequality, right, like Article 38 of the Indian state constitution does, right? Now, these are not justiciable directives. But what they have done is that when state action is challenged in the court as unconstitutional because it's trying to, say, do land reforms or redistribute property, this gives the state a constitutional legitimacy to the legislature, some ground to stand on before the court and say, look, back off, because this is our constitutional mandate. The Constitution has required of us to reduce inequality. And therefore you may not use rights, again, as a sword to get in the way. So these are both, in fact, moves, both the idea of constitutional directives as well as of defanging the right to reducing the salience of right to property or expanding it where it actually matters by universalizing a positive right to property. So these are things that reduce the power of courts. The one area where I think the courts can do something is a limited expansion of discrimination law norms in with respect to class. Right? Limited because I worry that a full-scale incorporation of class as a ground of non-discrimination will basically require the judges to call into question far more than they are capable of doing. And what it will do is it will actually reduce protections for race and gender and other categories because precedent created for one ground tends to apply to other grounds as well. But the two areas of discrimination law that I think can have value here is one, the procedural duty, procedural equality duty from British law that I mentioned, Section 1 of the British Equality Act, and something akin to indirect discrimination law, disproportionate impact law, in the context of fair political participation. So those are two areas where I think a judicial standard is manageable. Now, will courts do something about it? Probably not. In some contexts, they might, right? So there are many factors that affect judicial action, including social movement organization, the political discourse around an issue, and we can at least imagine the possibility that these can be exploited or used properly by trade unions and social movements in certain contexts. So that is the only judicial empowerment move. But the main strategy, I completely agree that the solution to inequality is political, not judicial, and we cannot deal with something as complex and multifaceted and fast-moving a problem and deeply entrenched a problem as inequality through courts. I have no doubt about that. I have no illusions about that. I think it is political. I think one thought about moving power from elected representatives to unelected ones. I just want to defend the idea of guarantors here. Guarantor institutions are not like courts in that they are actually responsible. They're appointed by political representatives and they're accountable to political representatives, but they act with a measure of autonomy from political representatives. And I see them not as less democratically legitimate, but more so because their independence and their accountability requires cross-partisanship. So they defend cross-partisan constitutional norms, and the government of the day cannot mess with them on its own, right? So I think that they are in some ways more deeply political institutions, and leaders of these institutions need a measure of political nous, but not partisan politics, rather constitutional politics. So that's my thought on guarantors. The final point on the middle class. So here I agree that context matters, and a lot of the things that I've talked about is just undoable or infeasible in the US, and I'm certainly not going to fight Professor Raber on that because I'm sure he's right. The trickle-down theory, my worry is that while empowering the middle classes can sometimes trickle down to the very poor, often, and we've seen this in the trade union movement as well, in places, often what happens, in fact, is the entrenchment of middle class interest against the poor, where things like, job security, and there are very good reasons to reduce precarity, right? But increased job security in certain types of jobs also means that those who don't already have it have an even less chance of getting it. Also, and trade unions also tend to cater. So, I do think that, making the gap between the middle classes and the very rich smaller is a great idea. I'm certainly not against it. I think it's good for its own sake. And if there are benefits that trickle down to the poor, even better. But I am skeptical about the possibility that these gains will always or even often trickle down to the poor. I think But this is an empirical matter, and I don't have to have very much to say on it. I just want to end with one final comment, which is, in terms of values, the decline in the attraction of a very old-fashioned idea used to be very popular with the trade union movement, right, of solidarity, where today, when everything is customized and, everything has to be bespoke, we all want to be different and we all want to celebrate our differences, right? But something is lost, something important is lost in our having given up the old left value of sameness and solidarity. And of course, they have been quite rightly criticized for being exclusionary on grounds of gender, on grounds of race, etc. But is it possible to not be exclusionary on these other grounds and still see that there is something good about these, old-fashioned ideas of solidarity or that Cinderella of the French Revolution, fraternity, right? Is at least having the potential to play some role alongside the other values of the French Revolution that we rightly celebrate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kaitan. So now we have the time for the Q&A. I already have two small questions, and I wonder if any of our colleagues also want to make their questions. Thomas will also have questions here. Anyone else? Maybe we could collect something like three questions. Okay, João Vitor, and then having the answers from Professor Kaitan. So for me, Professor Kaitan, the first question is related to the very idea of a liberal constitutionalism, because yes, I understand this is the main argument that of your text is that liberal constitutionalism would have the proper tools to deal with the problem of material inequality, but it looks like let's say the kind of evolution of constitutionalism in the past 200 years was in the sense that the basics of liberal constitutionalism should be, we should add to it something different and something that gives another dimensions to constitutionalism as a whole. So something in the sense of thinking about social constitutionalism in Spain or in Portugal or even Brazil. People talked about an idea not only of a welfare state, but something like a democratic constitutional state, which would include those preoccupations with social justice, for instance. The very idea of a transformative constitutionalism was interpreted in a certain sense to include inequality. So my question would be in that sense, shall we think about another interpretation, just another interpretation for liberal constitutionalism or something else? And secondly, I would ask you about the problem with the elitist Kurds, the way by which we could, like Professor Raber just said, we could have plutocrats deciding in Kurds problems that are for the relative poor. And in that sense, should we think about other forms of forming Kurds that could be sensitive to these problems? Let's say a kind of affirmative action for Kurds. This is something that we should also think about. So my questions are these one. Maybe we should hear Thomas and João. We will also have questions from Radha, and then but let's hear from Thomas, and then we go back to Professor Kaitan. Thomas.
Sorry to interrupt. Can I just clarify? Is affirmative action for whom?
For composing the Kurds. The way by which we form Kurds, should we think about ways by which we should, let's say, think about including people that were educated, of course, but that could be also poor people, people coming from minorities. In other words, people that could be really sensitive for problems relating to inequality. Thomas, please.
Thank you, Emilio. I would like just to start by saying that I was able to read like only 15–20% of the paper, but I was very impressed with it. And I think that after the presentation, like I could get a sense of it. And it's really remarkable, the attempt to connect a discussion that is well developed in political philosophy, but it doesn't reach law. And so this connection. And sometimes in constitutional law, I am a kind of I transit between philosophy and law all the time. So in constitutional law, people talk about balancing and trade-offs all the time. And I think that this makes me a little worried, because you think that you begin to think that equality and liberty are antagonistic values, or like judicial autonomy and accountability are different things. But I think that the right way to read values is to try to explain how they connect and how they reinforce one another. And I think that we should do that in the disciplines of constitutional law and political philosophy. So I was very well impressed. I would like to say something about the very last point that you made. I didn't get to that part of the paper, but when you say that once the people reach office, they tend to become part of the elite, and sometimes they share the dispositions and the automatic responses of the elites that drive their judgments and the way that they reason about controversial issues. And I think that this is precisely the case in Brazil. I don't know if there's time to do that, Emilio, but I have just one table. Can I show it on the screen about the judicial salaries in Brazil? Can I share a slide? Because I want to show Tarun this, if possible.
Yes. Are you allowed to do that, or?
It's disabled. I cannot share screen, so I can read the data for you. If you consider, I made a table that you know this table, Emilio, is that I compared the average judicial compensation in relation to the per capita income across the world. The European average is 2.98. The US federal judges is 4 to 1. In Brazil, it's 38.9. So it means that the moment you become a judge in Brazil, you are like this huge elite, and you begin like earning money like a CEO. How can you think about equality? Every time the Supreme Court decides a labor law case, it's against the laborers, the workers in Brazil. They have this kind of automatic response. The first judgment, the first reaction is always against the poor in Brazil. So I think that this is a reason for skepticism. But I think that a paper like yours do much more than any court could ever do. I think that we academics might have a good responsibility, because we have to make this information accessible to people. The reason I still believe in public reason. I believe in this very political liberal Rawlsian idea that once people come to know things better, they will mobilize themselves, and reason will just prevail. So I think that you mentioned many alternatives. There is one in Brazil that we adopt: compulsory voting. I mean, think of Justice Barroso in Brazil. He's an advocate of abolishing compulsory voting. These are the things that we protect. One of the very few weapons that we have on the side of the poorest in Brazil. And I think that your paper it's not I don't know if you can come up with a question from everything that I'm saying. It's more like a comment. But I see a very interesting and insightful effort to combine practical solutions with theoretical principles. And I think that this is the direction that we should go. And perhaps we academics can do much more than judges by making these solutions accessible to the people. That's my only point here.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. Let's just hear from Kaitan, Professor Kaitan, and then in the following we collect another questions from João and Professor Raber.
Thanks, Emilio. So starting with your question, I know that, in certain circles, especially most of my friends who would identify as left-wing, liberal has become a term of abuse, right? So you call somebody a liberal when you want to challenge their intelligence or their bona fides. So I'm not invested in the fight over labels. If it serves your purposes better to call it social liberalism or economic liberalism, or no, definitely not economic liberalism, right? Liberal socialism, something like that, or welfare state or whatever. Do it. It's I think once a country has done it, then as scholars we can talk and discuss and critique. I think for practical problem solvers that are politicians and judges, they don't have the luxury of conceptual tidiness that we as scholars do. So they should do what works, to my mind. Having said that, I am obviously a liberal of a certain strand, and I do believe that liberalism is incompatible with capitalism. And by the way, this is a view shared by the high priest of liberalism, John Rawls, in his latest work on the restatement, is explicit not only that laissez-faire capitalism is incompatible with liberalism, he says even welfare capitalism is incompatible with liberalism. And this is Rawls, right? It's not the bit of Rawls that law students or philosophy students are taught particularly. You read your theory of justice and you read political liberalism. Very few people come to the restatement, which is his sort of last most mature work, right? It says the only way for a society to be liberal is either to be socialist or to be what he calls a property owning democracy, right? Which is where my universal right to property will take you. Everybody has a minimum amount of property with them, right? So I think that liberalism is a hugely important value, has a lot of fundamental truths to it, that the critical attack on liberalism can often be made from a very global north perspective. It does not appreciate the reality of the importance of fundamental liberal freedoms, of freedom from torture and freedom from arbitrary arrest and freedom from all of these goods that liberalism gives, by the way, mainly to the poor, that are hugely important, especially in the global south, right? So it's very easy sitting in a safe university campus in the US and the UK to criticize liberalism as whatever, a sellout or legitimizing oppression. The way I look at it, I would insist on what liberalism really is. But, if you and I are going to vote on the same policy in the same way, and you call it socialism or Marxism, and I call it liberalism, it's not a fight that I'm particularly concerned about as a pragmatic matter. On affirmative action for the poor, so affirmative action, by its very nature, at least the way in which we think about it in discrimination law context, is at best a limited symbolic tool that can help a handful of people from a disadvantaged community for certain limited purposes, like creating the next generation of leadership, role modeling effect, symbolic impacts, diversity in elite spaces like law schools and things like that, right? affirmative action is not a poverty alleviation program, and it cannot be, simply because of its very limited reach. It's important, it's spectacular, it gets a lot of political salience, but in the grand scheme, it helps very few people. Combine that with the idea that the class ties are loose and are often broken as soon as you move up the class ladder. To the extent that that is true, you will lift individuals out of poverty by using affirmative action for class. But I'm not sure how much, unless you have such a wide-ranging affirmative action program that you're helping a substantial chunk of the poor. And then that's a redistributive program of a different order. That is not affirmative action to my mind. Then we're talking about land reform or something like that, right? Which I totally support. So I'm skeptical about how much affirmative action can help. And my worry is that if you have such a program, it can become lip service to the idea of dealing with the problem, right? Where governments can show, look, we have 5 poor judges, formally poor judges, because they will become formally poor judges very quickly, right? Without having to do very much. Thomas, thank you very much for your comments. And I think on this idea of compulsory voting, I absolutely agree with you that, it's one of the best tools in the arsenal of measures that we need to think about political participation of the poor. And there's good data on it from Australia. And, if you're dealing with this in the Brazilian context, I think Ross Dixon's chapter in that book that Mark edited, Constitutional Democracy in Crisis, with Mark Tushnet and Sandy Levinson, basically attributes Australia's relative stability to the compulsory voting mechanism. So we can talk more about it. But Mark also mentioned in his comments why parties are important, and I forgot to respond to it. I absolutely agree that parties are hugely important. In fact, the key to solving not just this, but many of our other problems. And I have a paper on parties as well. So you can see that I'm writing the book in chunks because I didn't want to commit to writing the full book. But how, plutocracy, directives, guarantors, parties, they fit together into a bigger story. And this part of the point that I make in this paper is how constitutions should think normatively about political parties and what they can do about political parties. And one of the principles that I think democratic constitutions should have in relation to parties is to make sure that no salient voter type is left politically orphaned, right? So salient voter types are defined by politically salient axes in a given society. That used to be the left-right axis for a long time in many global north countries. Now it's also become a 2-axis polity with left-right axis and the nativist and cosmopolitan axis, and therefore you have 4 salient voter types, etc. Right? So the party system has to be, a healthy party system is one which allows political parties to emerge to cater to particular voter types. And if a voter type is left orphaned, and I think in most of our democracies today, the poor have been left orphaned, the system is diseased, and we need to fix the party system in order to fix the system.
Thank you so much, Professor Kaitan. João had raised his hand before. I don't know if he still wants to make a question. João, please.
Yes. First of all, thank you very much for the organizers and the opportunity for making such this question. I'm talking from the Chilean Constitutional Convention, so I'm likely to have some issues with my internet connection. So I'm sorry if my internet just stops. But well, to get to the point, I was struck by a paper by Professor Kaitan, which he sent to me a couple of years ago about the political lockout of the poor, and we actually exchanged some emails, and he was a great contributor to one of my first pieces. So I'm really grateful to you, Professor Kaitan. And but what happened in Chile happened nowhere else. And as all you know, the neoliberal model was pushed much further down still in people's hearts and minds in Chile. And that deepened socioeconomic inequalities and broadening the political lockout of the most vulnerable sectors of the society. This was the idea of that paper, which I discussed with Professor Khaitan in the past. But now he mentioned Marxism and liberalism, but maybe there are other defining features of today's political culture as the ones, for example, which are shaping the Chilean constitution making process. So whereas Professor Tarun Kaitan sees the impact of class politics, let's say like that, as a significant source of identity his work, I see no single member of the Constitutional Convention here in Chile asserting to represent the working class. My internet is unstable, so I would like to, I don't know if you know, but I could explain it further if you want, but instead of communism, here we have feminism. Instead of war on poverty, we have climate change. So these variables set us in on a new path. See, so the translation of these variables into new electoral rules introduced reserved seats for indigenous people and secured gender parity in the electoral outcome of the election for the constitution-making body, and also the participation of independent constituencies within the process. So the question is understood within your body of work. Are these ideas consistent with the sort of normative agenda which looks for a response to this sort of injustice? Are these legislative quotas an alternative to what Professor Raber called bottom-up institutions? What do you think about what's going on in Chile? What do you think about reserved seats in the legislative body, in the executive body, and within the judicial branch? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, João. Now, Professor Rader, please.
Thank you very much, Emilio. I want to say a special thank you to Tarun, and Tarun, great to finally meet you on this forum. And Mark, greetings to you too, and thank you for the great work you've been doing on the Constitutional Democracy Forum. Very, very informative. Tarun, I want to thank you for that really, really insightful paper you gave today. And what it does, or what it has done, among other things, is to make me think about our own system here. And it's more of a comment to Tarun, and I'd certainly appreciate any reaction to that. Political lockout, as you say, of any group is a constitutional problem. And while, courts may be involved, the solution ultimately is not judicial, but in the realm of constitutional politics. And that's really interesting. In our system, your paper gives me grist for the mill for a paper I'm currently preparing for a conference at the Center for Constitutional Studies in Alberta on legacies of patriation. And what happened in 1981, 1982 is that Canadians entrenched a Charter of Rights in our Constitution and a domestic amendment procedure to change the Constitution without having to resort to the UK Parliament, and also made the Constitution a Canadian document finally, because the BNA Act, which served as Canada's Constitution since 1867, was no more than an act of the British Parliament. So we secured those features in 1981, 1982, but without Quebec's consent. Quebec was not signatory to the changes. The 9 provinces and the federal government reached an agreement, a settlement. And since then, now the issue of whether Quebec was left out deliberately or chose not to, is a issue of debate. But from my own research, Quebec was left out of the deal because when a deal was struck between the 9 provinces and the federal government at the time over those changes, anything Quebec's premier at the time, René Lévesque, would have introduced into the negotiations would have obfuscated, delayed, and thereby killed the agreement that was reached at that time. It was in the morning after Pierre Trudeau, then Prime Minister, said, we better take these signatures and run before somebody changes his mind. But what has happened since? Quebec sort of been on the periphery, constitutionally speaking. So we've had attempts to accommodate Quebec into the constitutional fold. There have been attempts like the Meech Lake Accord, the Charlottetown Accord. The issue of Quebec secession was eventually put to the Supreme Court of Canada, which advised in an advisory opinion that Quebec could not unilaterally proceed with secession under the Constitution, but that if it chose to do so in the future, it had to ask a clear question, get a clear majority, and then proceed with constitutional amendment to accomplish that. So what has also occurred in the 40 or so year period was Quebec's government's own initiatives. Currently, the Quebec government has a bill 96, to make Quebec a unilingual province, French, and the Quebec nation. Now, I am going to talk about, I'm going to offer a theme of conflict since Confederation, and especially since 1982 to now, but the conflict has taken on a more sophisticated character. And when you talked about your theme there was political inequality, material inequality and equality, and how you've sort of married constitutionalism with constitutional law, political philosophy, political theory, produced a very rich context to ameliorate constitutional democracies in terms of majorities and minorities and the have and have not. So your paper has allowed me to think more fully and deeply and broadly about the issue, because the normative theme I'm offering is one of conflict, but conflict has now taken on a more sophisticated, more nuanced, and probably a politically more salient what can I say, color at this context. So it's no longer just Quebec wanting, the move seems to be a greater autonomy for Quebec within the federation, but not a separate or independent Quebec. And of course, viewed from the perspective of the courts, in 1981, the Supreme Court of Canada pronounced on the issues and pronounced on constitutional conventions, which became, an issue of justiciability and appropriateness for the courts in all of this. The court said on the issue of conventions, a substantial measure of provincial consent was required by the provinces with the federal government to make those changes. So this is where we are in terms of a quote unquote, a lockout of a particular group within our particular federal experience. So Tarun, I thank you for that, but I'd appreciate any thoughts you may have on that. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Rod. And then we'll have the answers from Professor Kaitan. And I think that because we have a lot of time here of our event, we'll probably finish after that. Please, Professor Kaitan.
Sure. Thank you very much. So I'll first try to address Xiao's comment/question. So I'm not going to presume an ability to advise Chileans on their process. I know far too little to be useful. But from what you have said, or at least one way to read the problem of the absence of representation of the poor in the Constituent Assembly and the idea of reservations, political reservations, quotas for certain groups. Obviously, there is a boundary problem in identifying the poor and ensuring that they remain poor once you give them the quotas, right? Which is not a problem you have for other groups. And it's easier to think about affirmative action in other contexts. So in the accommodation literature, and this actually, rather pleasure to sort of meet you as well. This thought may respond to some of your comments as well in the Canadian context. And again, who am I to say anything about Canada? But in the accommodation literature, sort of thinking about political insurance and defending, protecting against lockouts, sort of the two or three broad sort of possible moves that are suggested are, first is the idea of consociationalism, which is, some sort of power sharing, quotas, or a minority's veto and things like that. Now, the obvious problem with consociational moves is that they entrench identities, right? So the very identities that in deeply divided societies you think are problematic become even more concretized, much more difficult to get rid of, right? And this may be the problem that you are facing in Canada. And against consociationalism, the alternative approach that is often suggested as an alternative is centripetalism, right? So ways in which you ensure that the excluded group is included without making the markers of exclusion salient, right? The analogy I draw with this is what I've called in my discrimination law work, indirect affirmative action. So indirect affirmative action is the flip side of indirect discrimination, right? Just as, once the Civil Rights Act tells the energy company you can't have a whites-only employees policy, Duke Power Company adopts a graduates-only rule, right? Why? Because in that context, in the socioeconomic context, most graduates were white, and therefore it used a proxy, that's indirect discrimination, or what Americans call disparate impact. And the Supreme Court, in the famous case, Griggs and Duke Power Company, said, no, you cannot do that, right? Now, the University of Texas did something similar for affirmative action when the Texas Supreme Court said you can't have race-based quotas. The University of Texas adopted an indirect affirmative action measure, which was the top 10% rule, right? Where the top 10% of every high school in Texas will be guaranteed an admission into the University of Texas because of the segregated nature of the geography of Texan high schools. That would ensure, in fact, more number of Black students getting in to the University of Texas than a direct racial quota, right? And that is sort of the flip side of indirect affirmative action. I know that they've become controversial in the US because somebody has challenged it in one of the circuit courts, but outside the US at least, I think it's seen as completely okay to do non-proxy based affirmative action where your intended beneficiary group is identified by proxies that don't directly track the group, and it keeps the political temperatures low while ensuring inclusion, right? So this long prologue is a way to suggest, or at least exhort constitutional scholars and constitutional framers to think about design possibilities that will lead to the greater political participation of the poor, but do not require us to frame rules that require an identification of the poor or to give them special benefits directly. Right? So indirect political inclusion is, I think, the way to go. And this is why I think compulsory voting is such a good idea. As a clear example of indirect political inclusion, if voting is not compulsory, the first group that is excluded is the poor. One of the first groups, right? Obviously, African Americans in the US also face serious, and obviously there are often overlaps with other groups that are excluded, right? But you can think of that. You can think of, so the party's paper that I posted a link to, right? Different electoral systems perform differently in how inclusive or exclusive they are, right? So to my mind, ranked choice voting, preferential voting systems are much more, have a lot more inclusive centripetal impact than first past the post, right? So how can we use models in constitutional design that are more likely to ensure the participation of the poor in the political process without requiring us to identify, target, and benefit the poor, because there will be leakages, and for reasons of conversion, I'm less sure about its utility anyway. I think it will be better. The final thought I want to end on, in picking up again on a comment that Mark made earlier, political time or civic time is a scarce resource, and when you are struggling with meeting fundamental needs, you're not going to have the time to engage in political activity. And that is why I think the separation of absolute poverty and relative poverty is so important. So there is no excuse for absolute poverty. And I would think that our definitions of absolute poverty should include not just an ability to feed yourself and clothe yourself and house yourself and educate your kids, but also an ability to be informed about and participate at least minimally in politics, because that is a marker of poverty, an inability to participate in the politics of your country, right? And so I don't think that that dealing with relative poverty and absolute poverty can be completely disentangled. Of course, we need to deal with absolute deprivation as well. But the problem of dealing with getting the poor as active participants in the political system will have to be multi-pronged. It will have to use tools like compulsory voting. It will have to include tools like raising the political power of groups like trade unions and NGOs that genuinely represent the poor or work on their behalf. And perhaps in some contexts, sure, affirmative action as well, right? So I'm not against affirmative action, right? But for me, the issue is when it comes to design, the answers are not ideological. The answers are evidence-based. Right? What works in your context? That's what you should do.
Thank you so much, Professor Kaitan. I think that we should probably end now. We have almost 2 hours of an event, a wonderful one. It was great to have both of you today, Professor Kaitan, Professor Raber. It was a fantastic lecture with great discussions. I think that we could use all of we discussed it today to wonder and think about other possibilities in the future. Someone just put a question in the chat, but I think that maybe we won't have enough time to do it today because almost 2 hours it's a long event, and I think that both professors have other commitments today. So thank you so much again. The UFMG seminar series is richer today, having this event, and thank you so much. Thank you for all the participants that joined us today. We'll make the video available in YouTube soon. Thank you so much.
Emily, I just want to thank you as well profusely and Mark for this event. And just to say quickly to the questioner, that's why we have these events. Don't underestimate the power of ideas and the power of translating ideas from the academy to the public discourse, right? So we can only do so much, but let's at least do so much and then worry about having lost.
Of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Tarun, Emilio, and those disembodied people we've been talking to.
Bye-bye.
So much. Bye-bye to everyone.